Are we about to witness the rise of a new Julius Caesar? This may sound like a strange thing to say, but if you study ancient Rome, you will realize that the circumstances that preceded the rise of Julius Caesar are very similar to the circumstances that we are in today. Tell me if any of what follows sounds familiar. The Roman Republic at the time of Caesar was dealing with enormous inequality between the classes. The upper class who ran the society were the sons of the great conquering men who had established the Roman Republic generations before. Now, the system that these warrior aristocrats built was one that was designed to favor themselves, and this somewhat made sense during the foundation of the Roman Republic, because they would be the ones who would claim the biggest share of the pie when they conquered other countries. And the men who participated in the army would get, some rewards as well, but they wouldn't be quite as big as the aristocrats, who were probably the braver generals or the better warriors. But overall, it would have been somewhat balanced. Everybody ended up winning. The Romans all got what they wanted, and the guys at the top got a little bit more, but it wasn't too crazy. But over the century, as the aristocrats' sons and grandsons were born into this system, they began to increase the distance between the classes. And all the Roman native men who would have grown up in this system would get outcompeted by this upper class. And you will never guess how this manifested. The Roman aristocrats developed an appetite for slaves. They were conquering all these territories, and they would go out and they would take slaves and bring them in to Rome to work for them. And of course, the aristocrats would get most of the slaves. Now, why would this cause significant problems? Because interestingly, the native Romans who would fight in the army would always have to eventually go back and work the farm again, or maybe work for wages. They weren't like the aristocrats where they had lots of money and land. They were always the sort of working class of Rome. And so, lo and behold, all this cheap slave labor that the Roman aristocrats would drag into Rome would drive down the price of labor for the native Romans. And the native Romans would find themselves not being able to get any jobs, not being able to make as much money. They would find themselves getting rapidly outcompeted by these aristocratic sons. And these sons of these aristocrats would create these giant farming plantations and giant slave operations, which would make them very rich, which would allow them to start doing what all smart rich people do, which is make your money work for you. So these rich sons of the aristocrats would start to open up banks or do loan deals where they would give out money to the native Romans because they needed to, take loans in order to maybe buy an apartment or move into Rome or make the farm work or buy things that they needed because the native Romans weren't making enough cash. And so what began to happen in ancient Rome is all the native Romans would get replaced by slaves. The native Romans who fought in the armies and would go over to these foreign countries and conquer these places and hold up swords in the legions to these slaves would then see these slaves in Rome taking their jobs when they got back, leaving them broke, forcing them to travel to the Roman city and sell their farm to this aristocrat. They would go to the city and have nothing for themselves and end up becoming impoverished and end up in a ghetto or stuck in some crappy city apartment. They would also then find themselves in enormous debt to these aristocrats. Meanwhile, these aristocrats were running around having all sex slaves that they could have their way with all day, every single day, not having to work a tap, and going in and calling the shots on how the empire is ran. And this enormously demoralized all of the native Romans. They began to get very upset about this. Now, this is quite a surprise to a lot of people, because people would imagine that Julius Caesar is either a badass, Superman, Nietzschean aristocrat who loves, giving wedgies to the poor people and stuff like this. Or they would imagine that Julius Caesar is this horrible monster tyrant that just wanted to kill everybody and had this lust for power and destruction. But the way that Julius Caesar appears in this context is as a liberator of the people from the oppression of a plutocratic oligarchy of aristocratic scoundrels who had formed a class warfare project against their own native people and begun to replace them and put them all into debt for no other reason than to satiate their greed, with no foresight at all to the damage they were doing. Now, the problem for these working class native Romans is that they have no real way to reform the system because they're not the ones in the aristocracy who run the entire show. so they have no way to stop this exploitation and abuse. But then somebody like Caesar comes along, who is from the aristocracy, who is a political man and a military man, and also an unbelievable genius. And he represents them. And he forms as this Superman who turns on his own class and holds them to account and says that you're running a regime of exploitation that's going to destabilize Rome, that's betraying the native population of working class men who make up our army, and is going to cause a revolution that will wipe this entire thing out. I'm going against you. I'm going to fight for the people, and I'm going to create a system that favors the people and is more fair and disempowers you because of the way that you've been acting. But of course, what makes Caesar special is that he had the military genius that allowed him to follow through on this threat. A petty revolutionary would not have stood much of a chance against the Roman aristocracy, but Caesar was no petty revolutionary. He was one of the most exceptional men that had ever lived. And in his incredible life, he managed to play the political game and the military game so well that he broke the oligarchy. And the people were so thrilled that they actually had somebody fighting for them that they essentially turned him into a living god. They were pushing him in to do whatever reform he wanted, to the point where he essentially became a king of Rome. And this threat, of course, was so frightening that the oligarchy had him assassinated. And so the question for us is that obviously a lot of this sounds like our situation. I think there are many native people in the West who feel like they're getting disenfranchised. They feel like they're getting exploited by even things as specific as debt scams. And many people feel there's a foul, traitorous oligarchy in place that do not like the people of the West and are trying to damage them or exploit them. And this is why I ask you, should we expect a new Julius Caesar in the future? Do you not get the feeling that people are in that place where they just simply do not trust the establishment? They want somebody who represents them, and they are willing to give up everything to a figure like this. If a figure comes who's truly fighting for them, they don't even want free will. They will fight in his army as long as he has a vision for the future. And so does this mean that we're coming up to this moment where if a man appears who's able to get things done, and he also stands for the people and people trust that he's being sincere, will we have a Caesar of the 21st century, a flame dropped in to a fireworks factory?